Well, friends, I've got a question for you this morning. What is loyalty? I was in a meeting a few weeks ago where it was on a Zoom call, and there were 10 of us in this meeting, and something interesting kind of happened. There were two guys in this meeting from their homes, and one guy showed up in a t-shirt, and it had his favorite NFL team emblazoned across the chest. And I noticed another guy in the meeting was not too happy about that. And sometime during the meeting, all of a sudden, his NFL team appeared across his chest. He went and changed in the middle of the meeting. Well, that didn't deter the other person. Suddenly, more Seahawks gear started to appear in the Zoom call. And not to be outdone, all of a sudden more Patriots gear started to appear during the Zoom call. And this went back and forth and back and forth. And this is what loyalty looks like, isn't it? I mean, we are here in Ryderville, and we know what it means to be loyal. We know what it means to wear our green and white in the good, the bad, and everything in between. We know what loyalty is all about. What is loyalty, though? How would you define it? Here's what I'd like you to do. With the people that you're with right now, I'd like you to turn with them and answer two questions for me. The first is, what is loyalty? And the second is, what does loyalty look like? And we're just going to stop for a second and just take 2 minutes, and I want you to discuss this with the people that you're watching this with. What is loyalty, and what does it look like? And if you're all alone right now, I want you to get on the chat room, and Pastor Colin is there, and I want you to interact with him and tell him what you think loyalty is and what it looks like. So let's just do that right now. Well, what is loyalty, and what does loyalty look like to you? You probably came up with some images of people who are loyal. You probably thought of some words that define loyalty to you. Here's another question I want you to answer. And again, we're going to stop for a second and just discuss it. What does disloyalty look like? Okay, we know what loyalty looks like. Maybe we've got some names of some people who've been loyal in our life. Now I want you to define what disloyalty is and what that looks like. So go ahead and do that right now. Well, what is loyalty? What is disloyalty? You've probably come up with some definitions or some stories maybe that represent this. And these are two things that we deal with throughout our whole life. We live on a spectrum or a continuum, as it were, of loyalty and disloyalty. Somewhere in our life, depending on the situation, depending on the relationships that we're in, we find ourselves somewhere in between loyalty and disloyalty. If you were to put yourself on this spectrum that we have, where would you put yourself on this line? Let's put that up on the screen right now. Just where would you fit between loyalty and disloyalty? I think that it depends on the person, doesn't it? It depends on the situation that we're in. That we fluctuate between the two things. We do this in relationships, we do this in situations, we even do this in our relationship with Jesus. That sometimes we find ourselves in our relationship with Jesus where our loyalty fluctuates, but we don't even realize it. You see, often loyalty and disloyalty is easy to identify in the people around us, but it's hard to identify in ourselves. John Maxwell once said that we judge others by their actions, meaning that, you know what, when someone is disloyal, we clearly see it and we judge them by the things they do. We know who they are by what they do. But Maxwell says we judge ourselves by our intent, meaning that don't look at what I do, look at what's in my heart, what I meant to do. And this is why it's so hard for us to see what loyalty looks like in ourselves, but so easy to see what loyalty looks like in someone else. And so my question to you is, are you loyal to Jesus in every situation? The good, the bad, and everything in between. It's sometimes hard for us to know. But here's what I want you to know, friends. Loyalty is the mark of a Christ-centered life. A Christ-centered life is marked by being loyal. And someone who is loyal to Christ is loyal throughout, no matter what gets thrown at them, no matter what life may do to them. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Revelation. We're going to look at Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 to 11. And as we're going through this passage, and actually these weeks that we're in this series called Praxis, we're looking at 7 messages to 7 churches in the area of the world that we know today as Turkey. And these messages were written at the end of the 1st century, and the one we're looking at is a message to the church in the city of Smyrna. Now, Smyrna is a lot like us. Smyrna knew what loyalty was all about. They didn't have a rider team to cheer for. That's how we know about loyalty, because we are loyal to our riders, right? I mean, I've lived in Regina since I was 11 years old, and it has always been Riderville. We have always cheered for the riders. Sure, I know there's some of you out there who don't cheer for the riders. Be forgiven. That's okay. We still love you. But by and large, we all cheer for the riders, and we know about loyalty because we've seen the ups and downs of the riders. And Smyrna knew about loyalty as well, just like us. You see, Smyrna had pledged its loyalty to Rome long before they ever had to. Rome was the center of power. It was controlling the whole world. Yet before Smyrna was under Rome's authority, before Rome had conquered all of the world, Smyrna pledged itself to Rome and to Caesar. And it had done this by building a temple to the goddess of Rome. This would be kind of like building a Stampeder store or a Blue Bomber store right next to the Riders store in Mosaic Stadium. That's what it would look like. Nobody would ever do that. That would be blasphemy, right? But Smyrna had pledged themselves to Rome over 100 years before they had to. And they had been loyal to Rome all throughout their time. And you know what? Smyrna understood loyalty. They understood loyalty to Caesar. You see, they were the first to build a temple to Caesar Augustus in 26 AD. And they had followed that by building temples to every Caesar, every emperor that had followed, including Emperor Domitian, who was at power at the time that this message was given. And they believed that as loyal citizens, that it was their job to worship Caesar. And Domitian, when he came to power, actually made it a law that everyone in the Roman Empire, once a year, had to go to a temple that was for him. And they would have to burn incense in worship of him. And in exchange for doing that, they would get a certificate from the priest of that temple that would say they had done their loyal Roman duty. And Smyrna took great pride in this. And if you didn't do it, if you resisted, you were considered rebellious and disloyal. And to that situation, Jesus writes. You see, the church in Smyrna refused to do it. They refused to worship the emperor no matter what. And because of that, everybody in Smyrna looked at them as disloyal, as people who were rebellious and troublemakers. And Jesus says these words to them. He says, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. Jesus says, I am the first and the last. He is the one who created all things. He was first. Before creation, before this world existed, Jesus was present. And he says, I am the last, which means that when everything falls down, when everything is destroyed, he will still be here. Jesus says, I am the first and the last, that I existed before the Roman Empire, and I will exist after the Roman Empire falls. I am the first and the last. I have the first word, and I have the last say in every situation, in every conversation. Jesus is the first and the last. And it says that he is the one who is dead and is now alive. You see, the Roman authorities, the Roman power, Pontius Pilate, had put Jesus to death. But even the mighty Roman Empire had no power over him. They had no authority over Jesus because he is alive, even though they put him to death. He came to life again. And Jesus, in the opening words of this message, reminds the church in Smyrna of who he is. And actually, every message that we are going through, the 7 messages to the 7 churches, begins with a description of who Jesus is. And Jesus reminds them and tells them something about who he is that they desperately need to hear. So what does the church in Smyrna need to hear? Well, they need to hear that Jesus is sovereign, that Jesus is over all things and has authority and power over all things. They need to understand that Jesus is greater. You see, this is a key to understanding loyalty. You see, we often falter in our loyalty because we think that something else is greater than something. We falter in our loyalty to people because we think that another friend or another boss is more powerful or more significant or has things that we could benefit from, that they're greater than what we were being loyal to. And friends, you can remain loyal throughout if you will realize that Jesus is greater, that Jesus is the first and the last, that even if you're facing injustice, even if you're feeling like you're beat down, that Jesus has the last word on everything. That Jesus is the one who died and is alive again, that he has the power over all things, even the power over life and death. And when we begin to see that Jesus is greater, we can be loyal to Jesus no matter what. And Jesus says to them, I know your afflictions, your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Jesus says, I know. He starts out by saying, I'm sovereign. You need to realize that I am greater than all of these things. You see, we need to have a grander vision of who Jesus is in order to remain faithful and loyal in this moment. And we need to recognize that Jesus knows what we're going through. Jesus says to the church in Smyrna, I know your afflictions. This word afflictions is sometimes translated as tribulations or as pressure. It's the word thlipsis in Greek. And it means to exert pressure on something, so much pressure that it's like a rock sitting on your chest. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt like life has thrown something at you and it is a rock that is sitting right in the middle of your chest, making it hard to breathe, making it hard to do anything? This is thlipsis, and Jesus says, I know your thlipsis. I know you feel like life has crushed you and you can't get up. And he says, I know that you are poor. Here's what you need to know. Smyrna was a rich city. It was called the flower of Asia. It was a beautiful city. It was a place where people came for commerce and there were many trade guilds. It was a prosperous city. And yet Jesus says to the people, the believers, the Christians in Smyrna, I know your poverty. You see, what was going on is the trade guilds who worshiped Caesar didn't like these rabble-rousers, these Christians, who declared instead that Jesus is Lord. You see, the Romans, a good Roman, a good Smyrnan, would say, Caesar is Lord. That's how they would greet you. But a Christian would say, Christ is Lord. And the Smyrnans didn't like that very much. And so they made it difficult for the Christians, the church, to buy and sell things. And they were incredibly poor in an incredibly wealthy city. And Jesus says, I know what's going on. I know how you feel like life has been beating you down. I know how you feel like you don't know where your next meal is going to come from. I know that you feel like everything is against you. But remember who I am. And friends, this is another one of the truths that we need to realize about what it means to be loyal to Jesus. You see, we often become disloyal because we think that what is going on right now is more important than anything else. And if you want to remain loyal to Jesus, you have to realize that Jesus is greater than this moment. But so we get so fixated on this moment that we cannot see what comes next. We cannot see beyond this moment. We become so fixated on the trouble, the afflictions that we find ourselves in that we can't see past it into anything else, and we lose all hope. But friends, if you will have a grander vision of who Jesus is, if you will realize that Jesus is greater, if you will realize that Jesus is greater than this moment, no matter what you are facing, whether it is injustice, whether it is health issues, whether you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, whether you find yourself out of work, Jesus is greater than this moment, and he is with you. And if you will remain loyal, he has something for you. Jesus says to the church, it's an interesting thing what he says next. He says to the church, you know what? Things are going to get worse before it gets better. Have you ever had someone say that to you? Things are going to get worse before they get better. Jesus says to the church, you know what? You're going to be put in jail. You're going to be put in jail for 10 days. And some of you may be thinking 10 days, that's not a big deal. Whoop-de-doo. Here's what you need to know. In the first century, jail was not a punishment. Jail was where you waited for your trial. The punishment came afterwards. And Jesus says to the church in Smyrna, you're going to be put in jail for 10 days. Again, you may think, well, 10 days, what a big deal. You might get off, right? See, it's not a literal 10 days. The numbers in the book of Revelation are figurative. And 10 in the rabbinic teachings means a set period of time. So Jesus says to the church, you're going to be thrown in jail awaiting trial, and then you'll be punished. But you're going to be thrown in jail for a set period of time, and I'm not telling you how long it's going to be. It's going to be for a period of time, and here's what happens in Smyrna. About 50 years after this letter was received, a man by the name of Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, who was actually a protege, someone who was discipled by John, the guy who wrote down these words that Jesus spoke. He's executed. He's martyred for his faith because he would not worship the way everybody else expected him to worship. And some scholars say that there have been more martyrs out of the city of Smyrna than from any other city in the ancient Near East when it comes to Christianity. You see, Smyrna was going to be persecuted for a set period of time, but this was centuries that it went on for. But Jesus says, you're going to be persecuted for a set period of time. This will last for a while, but it will not be forever. And friends, sometimes we find ourselves in situations where it feels like there's a rock on our chest. It feels like we are poor in every way. And I want you to hear this. This is for now, not forever. That Jesus is greater, and he is something even better for you. And if you will set your eyes on Jesus and recognize that he is greater, recognize that he is greater than this moment, if you will remain loyal to him, there is something waiting for you. Jesus says it like this. He says, be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as a victor's crown. A victor's crown. In Smyrna, as in all of the ancient Near East, there were the Olympic Games, just like we were supposed to have this summer. And people would compete. And when they won, they would stand on the podium. You know what this looks like because we watch the Olympics, don't we? You know they stand on that podium and they receive a prize, and then what gets put on their head? This crown, this laurel leaf crown is put on their head. And Jesus says, if you will persevere, if you will be faithful, if you will be loyal, even to the point of death, you will receive the victor's crown. A few years ago, I ran in a half marathon. Hardest thing I've ever done. And you know what? I ran with a friend, and he helped me greatly through that. Except about halfway through, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I started to walk as he was running, and I fell behind him, and I was on my own, and I kept walking and running and walking and running, and it was the hardest thing that I have ever done. And you know what kept me going to the end? Because my friend was already gone and finished. What kept me going to the end was actually the image of my wife and my kids at the finish line and the prize that was waiting for me at the finish line because we were going for ice cream afterwards. And I think there will be ice cream in heaven waiting for all of us because every good and perfect gift comes down from God above, and ice cream is great. Friends, Jesus says, be loyal. Be loyal to the end. Be loyal to the end, and you will receive a crown of life. That even if the pressures, the rock that's on your chest, the things that are coming against you, even if they take your life, this is not the end. Because death is just a moment. It is not the end. And we find ourselves with him who holds the keys to life and death. The one who is the first and is the last, and we will be with him. This is the promise of Jesus. You see, Jesus is greater than anything that's coming against you. Jesus is greater than the moment you find yourself in, and Jesus has something greater waiting for you today. And if you realize that Jesus has something greater waiting for you, you can remain loyal throughout. So how do we do this? How do we remain loyal throughout in all of this? Let me give you two practices, two praxis that you can do this week in order to remain loyal to Jesus no matter what you're facing. And if maybe things are going great for you, maybe just tuck these in your back pocket until you need them. First one is this. Ask Jesus to reveal himself in your situation. Maybe you got bad news from the doctor. Maybe you've got something coming up this week and you just don't know what to do about it. And you feel like everything is against you and you feel like there's a rock on your chest. Ask Jesus to reveal his presence to you. You know, I had someone say to me today, they said they came by, dropped off some goodies before church, and they said, it must be so hard for you to be here in this room and it's empty. And I was thinking about that, and I realized this as I was worshiping. I'm like, it's not hard, actually. Because you know what? As I look around this room, Jesus has given me the ability to see each of you in the seats that you usually occupy when we're together. And so to me, this room isn't empty. Because Jesus is here, and Jesus makes me feel your presence even though we aren't here. Ask Jesus to reveal where he is in your situation. You know, the book of Revelation is filled with images, revelations of Jesus. That's literally the title, the revelation of Jesus. And it reveals Jesus and where he is in history, in the good, the bad, and everything in between. And so ask Jesus to reveal himself to you in your history. Here's a second way. You know what? In my office, I have this shelf. And this shelf has things on it from my history, from the times when Jesus has shown himself to me. It has a letter from the RCMP when I was running away from God and wanted to join the RCMP. It has my graduation picture, my wife and my dad and my mom and me when I got my Bachelor of Theology, to remind me how I came back. It has a little cup, a wooden cup from when I took communion in Israel with some of my church family. It has rejection letters from churches that rejected me, but every time I got rejected, I had Jesus whisper to me, I'm with you. And I look at this shelf and I see the ups and the downs of everything in life. And I see Jesus. And I see that Jesus was loyal to me long before I was ever loyal to him. Actually, that's the symbol of the cross. The symbol of the cross is that Jesus is loyal. He is the first and the last, and he was loyal before you were even born, and he is loyal throughout your life. And all he asks is the same from you. And the second practice that I want to encourage you to do is begin to collect these things from your life that mark where Jesus was. So that when you find yourself with a rock on your chest, when you find yourself in difficult places and your loyalty is tempted, look at the shelf and be reminded of the loyalty of Jesus. It doesn't have to be a shelf. It could be a bracelet. It could be a necklace. It could be a picture on a wall. Put symbols around your house to remind you of the faithfulness of God. This is something they teach in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 6, it says, write these words of God's faithfulness on your doorposts. Wear them on your sleeves. Talk about them. You see, we need these symbols to remind us to be faithful throughout, to be loyal to Jesus throughout. So ask Jesus to reveal himself and begin to surround yourself with images of Jesus, symbols that remind you of who you are loyal to in the first place. The Christ-centered life is marked by loyalty. A Christ-centered life is loyal throughout, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Imagine if we all did this. You know, the city of Smyrna, the church of Smyrna, was loyal throughout in every single way. You know, of the 7 letters, there's only 2 where Jesus doesn't rebuke or challenge one of the churches. It's Smyrna and one that we're going to talk about in a few weeks. Smyrna's never rebuked. They're challenged to hold on tightly to it. They're encouraged, they're exhorted to remain loyal throughout. And you know, if Smyrna can do it, I think you and I can do it. I think we can be loyal throughout. And it starts by having a greater image, a greater vision of who Jesus is, because Jesus is greater than what's coming against you. Jesus is greater than the moment you are in, and Jesus has something greater waiting for you. Let's pray. Jesus, we worship you today, and we recognize that you are greater than all things. You are the first and the last. You are the one who holds the keys to life and death. You are the one who was dead and is alive, and we thank you and we celebrate you today, Jesus. And Jesus, some of my friends today, they need to see you. They feel like they have a rock on their chest. They feel like everything is against them, and Jesus, I just pray right now, would you just reveal yourself to them in their situation? Give them peace. Encourage their heart and their mind right now. Friends, if that's you, just put out your hands right now. Just put out your hands like you're receiving something, and let Jesus just pour into you right now. Jesus, we celebrate you. We thank you. You are greater. You are greater than this moment. You are greater than the moments we will face in the days and weeks ahead. You are greater than anything we are facing. And we know that you have something greater waiting for us, a crown of life, life in your presence. Oh, Jesus, we look forward to that today. In your name we pray. Amen.